In this paper, I'm going to be walking through language paper 1, question 2, which is a language question. Remember, this is the same question as question 3 in paper 2. The only real difference is that you have the extract here in front of you, so you don't actually have to block out the line numbers from the source because it's all here for you. Now, this is from the June 2020 paper. So diving straight in, when approaching the language question, what we need to do is we need to remember to look at the key focus of the question. So in this case, it's the description of the garden. So really we're looking at how the garden is presented by the writer, how it is ultimately being described by the words used. Now you always have these 3 bullet points as well. So you could include the writer's choice of words and phrases, language features and techniques, and sentence forms. Now, as I always say to my students, you need to cross out sentence forms. Just from experience, students find it very difficult to write about sentence forms in an effective way to actually gain any real marks. So the key is really to focus on these 2. Now, when we see words and phrases, what does this mean? So remember, these are things, like nouns, your adjectives, your verbs, etc. So these are the word classes. Then when we get to language features and techniques, these are, use of metaphor, personification, and similes, etc. Now remember, you only have 8 marks for this question, so really you want to be spending around 8 to 12 minutes on it, and you're looking at kind of 2 to 3 paragraphs, okay? Now you may choose, depending on what your teacher has taught you, but it might be your petal, your peasel, your peel paragraphs, but we're looking at kind of 2 to 3. Sometimes 2 is enough because really the focus is on the content of your analysis. So it's all about the quality and not about the quantity for this question. So let's just dive straight in. So when approaching the language question and looking at the extract in front of us, what we need to do is look at any words that really kind of stand out to us. Now we know that the focus is on describing the garden. So, straight away on the first line, I'm looking at, okay, well, it's described as being unfamiliar. That's quite interesting. And also the fact that it's overgrown. Now, just looking at these 2 words, I'm going to zoom in on unfamiliar. Now, the reason why is, obviously we know it's an adjective, it's describing. It's because when I think of something that's unfamiliar, immediately I'm thinking of connotations such as, it's an unsettling environment. We can link it to the uncanny. But ultimately it's presented as, this kind of unsettling, eerie environment. So really, straight away, we can tell that something isn't quite right here with the garden, especially as it has that kind of element of, if it's not familiar, then there's this kind of element of unknown within it, which again makes us feel fairly uncomfortable. Then with my second word choice, this idea of it kind of being overgrown connotes something that is quite wild, it's uncontrollable. And really, it's suggesting that this particular garden cannot be tamed. So there's definitely this type of power that's being presented here. I mean, we could go as far as to say, that there's this sort of human versus nature power struggle even. Then moving down, I think, we see here the real focus is on this mulberry tree. And this, I would say, would be the key focus of the garden here. Now, this particular simile, its knuckles in the earth like a gigantic malformed hand, stands out to me. And the reason for that is that it creates this kind of, this almost like this, it presents this tree as this kind of supernatural force even. Especially through, the adjective here, gigantic. when I think of, this adjective in regards to this tree and this, its knuckles in the earth like this malformed hand, I'm thinking, okay, it sort of suggests that it has this godlike power. So ultimately, it's fairly powerful within the situation of the garden. And then secondly, it's with this idea of power, which we kind of, touched upon up here, we could go as far to say that it's sort of controlling the nature around it, almost in a sense acting as this sort of dictator within the garden. And again, from this simile, another word that I would probably zoom in on would be the adjective malformed. Now I'm going to zoom up here. I'm running out of space down on the right. So this particular adjective, suggests that something is abnormal here, that it's distorted. And I'm just going to make a note of these. So it's abnormal. There's something that is distorted here. And ultimately creating this sinister environment, this sinister atmosphere. So I've got enough here really now to sort of start my first point, my first paragraph. So I'm just going to dive straight in. So the writer presents the garden as an... Now I'm looking at some of the words I've used, this idea of there's almost like this power struggle, I'm going to use uncontrollable, that it presents the garden as an uncontrollable sort of unfamiliar mess. Now I don't want to write down the whole quotation, so I'm going to cut this quotation up. So unfamiliar, and then I'm going to use ellipsis to cut all of this out. Unfamiliar mess. So I've made my point. I'm going to zoom in now. The adjective unfamiliar immediately establishes, I think, the garden as this kind of, and I'm going to bring in my notes up here. So adjective unfamiliar immediately establishes the garden as an eerie and unsettling environment. And then I'm thinking, okay, well, what, really I want to focus on the mulberry tree because that is really the key focus. So I'm just going to add that on here. I'm going to say, which is further illustrated, because I want to zoom in on this point in more detail using this simile. Which is further illustrated through the description of the mulberry tree. Okay, now I'm going to bring in my evidence, the simile, and zoom in on that. The writer presents the mulberry tree presents the tree as a supernatural force within the garden. particularly. Through the simile. Its knuckles in the earth. I'm going to write the whole one out. Like a gigantic malformed hand. So the writer presents the tree as a supernatural force within the garden, particularly through the simile. And then I've got the simile there, which develops. And I'm thinking about, okay, well, what image does it develop? And obviously I've got a couple of notes which I've gone through up there. So which develops the image of the tree as a dominating force with godlike power. Okay, so now I want to zoom in on words within the quotation and how it's, essentially personified. So I'm going to start with the personification. So the personification of the tree and the adjective gigantic creates the imagery. And again, I'm really focusing and kind of zooming on the idea of that it has a lot of power here. So the adjective gigantic creates the imagery of an overpowering presence. Almost like a dictator, controlling. And again, these are all ideas I've written up here, but I'm just formulating them into this paragraph. Controlling nature around it with its malformed hand. And now I'm going to zoom in on malformed. The adjective malformed. And again, I want to, explore and analyse that it's, this garden is presented as being quite sinister and abnormal and unusual. So I'm just going to add that in here. So the adjective malformed connotes something that is abnormal or distorted. And again, highlighting how unusual and sinister the garden is. Now, what's key here is, we want to focus as well on the effect on the reader. So, we need to include, how the reader, how we would be feeling, what our impressions would be. So I'm going to add that in here. So the description evokes, And again, with this idea of it being sinister, supernatural, unsettling, it would make us feel this sense of fear towards Rosie, towards our main character and her family, her children. So the description evokes a sense of fear within the reader. Because we are the readers, we are aware that the garden appears to be an unwelcoming place, even dangerous. Which could threaten Rosie and her children's safety. Okay, so that's my first point. Now I want to sort of zoom in on my second point. So the next thing that really draws me in and really catches my eye is this idea of this ivy. Now, what we know about ivy is that actually ivy grows very quickly. It sort of overpowers what it is growing around. And ultimately, it's very hard to control. So we could put it cannot be controlled. Again, which reinforces this whole idea that this garden has, this power, this supernatural power. Also, the way that the ivy here, it grew up through broken bricks and chunks of cement, and the fact that it's choking it stand out to me. And the reason is because, we have these man-made strong substances here, so particularly cement. So with cement, we know that it's a strong material. It's quite hard to manipulate. It's quite hard to break down. So the fact that the ivy is able to do this really shows the power of nature. Also the fact that we have this verb choking here. So we have this verb, and it's quite an aggressive verb as well, which is significant. Because again, it further establishes that this garden is dangerous, it's sinister, it almost won't allow anything to kind of grow or move within it. It's not very tolerable to sort of outside sources, aka humans or, man-made constructions, intervening with it. Okay, so I'm going to then move on to my second paragraph here, really focusing on the ivy. And again, I want to lead on from my previous points about the idea of power and it not being able to be controlled, especially with, the mulberry tree being presented as this kind of having this godlike power and being that dominating force. So the writer also presents the uncontrollable nature of the garden and its superior power. Now I've made my point, I'm going to zoom in. So for example, it's tangled ivy. So we've got an embedded quote. It's tangled ivy spreads through broken bricks and cement. the fact that, again, I want to talk about that it's able to kind of get through these substances. So the fact that ivy is able to break through cement. I'm going to add additional information in my dashes. A strong, just to reinforce my point. Strong man-made substance shows the strength of nature as it overpowers human constructions. Okay, so I'm now going to zoom in on the verb choking. So the verb choking further demonstrates again, I'm, reinforcing the idea that the garden's presented in a sinister way. So further demonstrates, but I'm going to expand here in a different way. The garden as sinister, even dangerous, as the aggressive word choice highlights and again I want to bring in that human versus nature debate here. So I'm thinking, okay, well, what is nature trying to do? Well, it's trying to, it almost seems through the ivy that it's trying to kind of claim back its territory from the humans and almost stop and defend its space and stop, that human involvement. So this aggressive word choice highlights how nature is reclaiming power against, I'm going to go as far as to say it's humanity by destroying anything in its path, by destroying anything in its path. And again, I'm going to think back to, how we would be feeling. So therefore, as readers, we feel that the garden dangerous and unwelcoming, especially to humans, as it has claimed its area and will not, I'm going to say, not tolerate human involvement. So again, as readers, we feel unsettled about the supernatural, almost demonic force within the garden. And I'm just going to actually finish off with this one off with a link to Rosie and her children. So almost a demonic force within the garden that will essentially fight against potentially or will oppose Rosie and her children's presence. Okay, so that I'm going to end there. So as you will see, I've got two key paragraphs or two paragraphs that I have zoomed in on in a lot of detail. And actually, really, I've only used, a few 2 to 3 quotations and just zoomed in on words from those quotations. So there's an example for you. And also, I said it was a June 2020 paper at the beginning. It was the June 2020, but it then was moved to the November 2020 paper. Okay, so hopefully you found that helpful. I will be putting more videos up with other questions, so have a little look at those too for revision. And any questions, just leave some comments below. Okay, thank you.